Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel and a very belated March recent reads. If you have watched my last video, my new house, building bookshelves, organising my books vlog, then you will know that I did move house recently. We now live in Hereford, near the Welsh border. Cameron is now a firefighter. Things have changed, hence my new background. This is not necessarily the new permanent setup. We will see how it goes and how much I like it. All that aside, I'm back now, I'm here, I'm feeling excited about reading and about filming. I've got tons of ideas. But first, let's just talk about what I read in March. In March, I read some new literary fiction proofs. I read some Women's Prize long-listed books. I read some translated fiction and some non-fiction. I also read a couple of poetry collections, including a new all-time favourite. I am so in love. Let's get into the reviews. Firstly, in March, I read Misplaced Persons by Susan Beale. This is a new literary novel that I was kindly sent a proof copy of by the publisher. Set in modern-day Belgium, the book follows the story of a family with 3 kids while the parents are going through a separation when the mum decides to offer their home as shelter to a Syrian refugee. I featured this book in my anticipated releases video earlier in the year. I was incredibly excited about it. I loved the sound of the themes of the refugee crisis and the family bonds. I loved how wide-ranging it sounded, but also how family-focused and character-focused as well. Unfortunately, though, this book did not deliver for me. The book is told from multiple perspectives. We get to learn about the father and the mother and the 3 children, and on the whole I was just kind of disinterested in these characters and what they had to offer. The beginning of the book was especially weak. It gave me Fleischman is in Trouble vibes, which is a book I hated. Just this mediocre middle-aged man complaining about his separation and fawning over younger women. It felt as though it took a long time to get to the heart of this novel, the interesting events and characters, and even then I didn't feel as though the novel harnessed these things and made the most of them and said anything even slightly profound. I just didn't think this was very well done, to be honest. A really interesting setup, good ingredients, but somehow the author just seemed to miss the mark for me at every turn, managing to make this story that should have been emotional and fraught and insightful just dull and unilluminative, if that's a word. This book didn't really give me anything. It was a massive shame, so in the end I gave it 2 stars. Also, I saw a review on Goodreads saying that this book should have been called Displaced Persons rather than Misplaced Persons, and they are totally right. Next up, we have The Dolphin House by Richard O'Brien. This is a new poetry collection from the awesome indie Broken Sleep Books. Thank you so much for sending me on this copy. Set in a flooded apartment on a Caribbean island, this collection explores a failed NASA-funded project to teach a dolphin the English language. The poet, I believe, did a lot of research on this event to put this collection together. And honestly, it paid off because this collection was awesome. It is so surreal and very visceral and philosophical. I just loved the vibes of this collection. It works so well as one little whole. I actually read this collection back to back a couple of times and I was totally submerged, mind the pun, by this whole reading experience. I loved that the collection focused in on this one specific event. The experiment is actually something that personally interests me anyway. For those of you who don't know, I do have a philosophy degree. I have studied the philosophy of language and it is bizarre and fascinating. I loved the way that this collection captured elements of the philosophy behind this experiment and why it may or may not work. The collection actually opens with the famous philosopher Wittgenstein's quote, "If a lion could speak, we couldn't understand him," which sets the whole thing off perfectly. The poetry in here is also just beautiful and whimsical and flowing. It creates a real water-like feel throughout. I loved reading this collection out loud. Some of the poems are from the perspective of the humans taking part in this experiment, and a stunning final poem in the collection is actually from the perspective of a dolphin. This was really great, really fun, really unique, a really good reading experience. If this one sounds interesting to you, definitely give it a go. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. Next up, we have Exciting Times by Nisha Dolan. I swear I am the last millennial literary booktuber ever to read this millennial literary novel. I'm sure you all know what this one is about by now. It is an incredibly popular contemporary novel following the story of a young woman named Ava who travels from Dublin to Hong Kong to teach kids. Here she meets two very different people whom she has different relationships with. So this is the most on-trend, fashionable, of the moment, if you like Sally Rooney, you'll like this book ever. And in many ways, it was totally what I expected. Dry, sparse language, cutting dialogue, angry, disassociated, sexually frustrated, borderline mentally ill millennials trying to figure their shit out. This is what I signed up for, and this is what I got. The biggest surprise about this whole thing, really, was that I didn't really like it. I get why people would like this. It is of a very specific type. And don't get me wrong, I do generally like that type, but this one specifically just pushed it too far for me. To me, this book read as though it was almost too concerned with being all of these aforementioned things that it kind of forgot about its characters. It forgot about what makes people authentic or interesting or likable. It forgot about what makes an enjoyable story. This was just too much, even for me. Aside from that, I also just didn't think that this book was particularly special in any way. It wasn't bad, you know, some moments were actually quite relatable, but was it good as a whole? Was it original or touching or well crafted or insightful? I just don't think so. So in the end, I had to give this one a 2.5 stars. Oh, and I forgot to say, this one is also currently longlisted for the Women's Prize. Next up in March, I read Transcendent Kingdom by Jasmine, another Women's Prize longlisted book. This one follows a Ghanaian family in Alabama, most prominently a young woman named Gifty, who is studying neuroscience at Stanford, and examines Gifty's relationship with her mother and her brother, who both at various points struggle with addiction and depression. So I love Yaa Gyasi. I fell in love with her when I read her debut, Homegoing, a couple of years ago. I vowed then that I would read anything she brought out. And this book was honestly quite a surprise. I found it to be so distinctly Yaa Gyasi, but at the same time so totally different to Homegoing. Honestly, this woman's range is something else. Yaa Gyasi's biggest strength, in my opinion, is definitely her characters, and this was certainly my favourite aspect of this novel. I bought all of these characters 100%. They felt real and raw and messed up. This was just a very moving and very believable portrait of one family. I loved the shades of grey in here, the nuance, the exploration of science and faith and family love, and just Yaa Gyasi's perceptiveness when it comes to messy family bonds and our roots, where we come from culturally and familially. All of this is just so good. She just always manages to build such a convincing picture. It's quite wonderful. Unfortunately, as brilliant as Yaa Gyasi is, I didn't love this one quite as much as Homegoing. It just couldn't really live up to it for me. I felt slightly less emotionally invested in the characters. It just didn't hit me the same way. But nevertheless, a great novel. I highly recommend it, and in the end I gave it 4 stars. Next up, I read Bear by Marian Engel. This is a new novel that just came out this month. I was sent this gorgeous proof copy by the lovely people at Daunt Books Publishing. I believe this is actually a Canadian modern classic that is just being published over here in the UK for the first time. It was actually written in the 1980s. And simply put, it follows a librarian who goes to a remote Canadian island to inventory some estate, and there she meets a bear. Trust me, you do not want to know any more about this book before going into it. This novel is just as intriguing and bizarre and unique as it sounds and looks. It is very short, but it packs a punch. I believe I read this one in one sitting. My bath was pretty cold by the time I was done, but I just couldn't stop reading. And I do think that is the best way to consume this novel. Read it as the compact, intimate snapshot that it is, and just take it all in. I really liked the writing in here. It is quite simple but very visceral. I loved the Canadian setting. I was really intrigued by this main character and her mundane life and what was going on with her before this relationship forms with this bear. I also really liked the tone of this novel, how psychological it felt and how it was kind of tinged with darkness. A very strange read, a very interesting read. Honestly, I was kind of left in somewhat of a daze when I finished it, but the more time that passes and the more I look back on it, the more I appreciate it. If you have a spare hour or two and this sounds interesting to you, then definitely give it a go. In the end, I gave it 4 stars. Next up, I read Death of a Naturalist by Seamus Heaney. Honestly, I haven't even started talking about this book yet, and I already feel a bit emotional. This is a poetry collection by the lauded Irish poet Seamus Heaney. I actually believe that this was his debut, and it primarily explores his childhood in rural Ireland and his family and his lineage. So I have read Seamus Heaney's poetry before. I read his much later collection, Human Chain, a couple of years ago. I really liked it. I didn't love it. I then discovered his poem Blackberry Picking through an anthology I read a few months ago and absolutely fell in love. I then went out and bought this collection because it features blackberry picking, hoping that I would adore this collection as much as I adore the individual poem, and man did I love this collection. I could try and verbalize the things that Seamus Heaney does so exceptionally well in this collection. The tenderness and rawness and unflinching openness of his poems, how personal they are, filled with heartache and hope, the beautiful lyricism and wordplay and rhyme, the stunning sounds that are created, harsh and striking, but also soft and comforting. The vivid imagery that is evoked of rural countryside living, something that I personally relate to. But really, everything just worked so well together in this collection on a level that I can't describe. You know, when you just have one of those incredibly special reading experiences where you just relate to what you've read on such a deep level. You drink it all in, you feel seen, your thoughts and feelings that you didn't even realize you had have been articulated so well. I was talking to my mother-in-law about Seamus Heaney's poetry, and she said it's almost a relief to have something articulated so well. And fuck me, that just summed it up so well. I love this collection. It's the new favorite collection of mine of all time. I could reread these poems over and over and over again. If you love poetry at all, please read this. Of course, I gave it 5 stars. The penultimate book I read in March was King of Rabbits by Carla Neblett. This is another new novel that I was kindly sent a copy of. This one tells the story of Kai, a mixed-race boy who lives on a council estate in Somerset over 2 timelines, one when Kai is quite young and one when Kai is a teenager. It's a story of race and working class men and what makes us who we are. So I really liked this book, at the same time as it not being exactly what I thought it was going to be. From the synopsis that I'd read previously, I thought that this novel was primarily going to explore Kai's relationship with his childhood best friend, Safi. And while that relationship is super integral to this story, it isn't really the main focus throughout. The book is much more focused on Kai himself and all of the different various relationships that constitutes his life. We explore what happened to Kai when he was around 5 years old, his mother struggling with alcoholism, and his father involved in various crimes. We learn about his 3 older sisters and some of his relationships at school, and we then see Kai many years later when he is 15. His home life looks completely different. He's in a not so great relationship and he's just trying to figure stuff out. So like I say, I really liked this book. I loved the setting. It felt totally convincing, totally English. I really enjoyed learning about this family. The characters on the whole were very authentic feeling and interesting. It was great to see the struggles that faced this family and learning about Kai and his aspirations and dreams and what he learnt from where and whom. This book was also surprisingly plot driven. There were a couple of little twists twists and reveals that I didn't see coming, and I enjoyed that very much. Unfortunately, I do think that I was hindered from totally loving this novel because I went into it wanting something else. That being said, I do think this book was really good, well written, well rounded, really interesting and emotional. A really solid debut. So in the end, I gave this one 4 stars. And the final book that I read in March was British by Afua Hirsch. This is a non-fiction book that I have been meaning to read for fucking ages. It explores race and identity in modern day Britain, confronting our imperial past and our, in many ways, still very much racist present. I'm sure you've all heard about this book. It was incredibly popular a couple of years ago, and I'm just so glad that I finally picked this book up and read it. It is so worth it. My favourite kind of non-fiction books are those that speak to broader social or political or philosophical issues, but have a real intimacy and foundation of personal experience to them. And that is exactly what you get from this book. You really feel as though you get to know Afua Hirsch throughout this book and learn about her experiences and what constitutes her identity. This brilliantly shines a light on the wider issues at play, sitting alongside other people's experiences and experiences from the past just perfectly. Overall, this is just a really great UK-focused book about race and identity and belonging. I have read significantly more books about race that are US focused rather than UK focused, so this was great. It was informative and readable. I'd say it is a great introduction to these kind of issues if you haven't read much about them before. I definitely recommend picking this one up, and in the end I gave it 4 stars. So there we have all of the books that I read in March. I really hope you all enjoyed hearing me chat about them. Let me know if you've read any of them or what the best thing you read in March was. As always, I can't wait to chat to you all down below in the comments. It really does make my day. A big thank you to everyone who's watched this video, who watches any of my videos. I appreciate it so much. Let me know what you think about this setup, the new background. Perhaps I can play around with it a bit more, and I will hopefully see you all really soon with another video. Bye everyone.